The wind had finally died, but the world it left behind was unrecognizable. What was once a quiet stretch of rural Missouri now looked like a war zone. Trees lay splintered like matchsticks, roofs torn from homes, and the ground was littered with broken memories. Children's toys, photos, scraps of lives scattered like leaves. As the sun rose through the smoky haze, first responders and volunteers began combing through the wreckage. Among them was a local fire chief named Jack Morgan, a man who had seen more than his share of destruction, but even he couldn't ignore the strange silence that hung in the air. Tornadoes usually left behind the sound of chaos, sirens, crying, calls for help. But this one had taken more than buildings. It had taken voices too. Then came the sound, a sharp, raspy cry. Not human, not mechanical. Something wild. Jack stopped in his tracks, his boots crunching over shattered glass and with splinters. The sound came again, somewhere beneath a collapsed porch. He motioned to the crew. "Over here," he called. They approached cautiously. Something was trapped under the debris, but it wasn't a person. A clawed paw pushed through the broken boards. Dust-covered fur. A flash of golden eyes. It was a bobcat. For a moment, no one moved. Bobcats weren't exactly known for cozy interactions with humans, especially not in disaster zones. But this one, it didn't growl. It didn't hiss. It didn't run. It stared. Jack signaled the others to hang back and slowly knelt down. "Easy now," he whispered, extending a gloved hand. The bobcat blinked but didn't flinch. Its breathing was shallow, its body scraped and bruised, but was alive. More importantly, it seemed to want help. Jack had grown up in these woods. He knew wild animals. He'd hunted, tracked, even rescued his fair share over the years. But this was different. Working carefully, the crew removed the collapsed wood until the bobcat was able to crawl out. It limped slightly, but there was something urgent in its movements. It didn't flee into the woods like they expected. Instead, it turned and looked back. Then it began to walk, slowly, deliberately, stopping every few steps to glance over its shoulder at Jack. "Is it leading us somewhere?" one firefighter asked. Jack nodded slowly. "Looks like it." The bobcat was heading into the deeper part of the damaged woods, moving carefully through a path littered with debris. It didn't rush. It didn't hide. It wanted them to follow. By now, a few other volunteers had gathered, watching in disbelief as the animal navigated through fallen branches and twisted metal. They followed for nearly 15 minutes. The bobcat always a few paces ahead, pausing just long enough to make sure they were still coming. Then it stopped beside a shattered oak tree, its roots pulled from the ground. Underneath the roots, barely visible beneath a tarp and broken siding, was something no one had noticed, a cellar door. Jack rushed forward. The bobcat didn't move. He yanked the bent metal handle and flung the door open. The smell of dust and stale air rushed out. A coughing sound came from below. "Hello," Jack called. A faint voice answered. "Help, please." The team sprang into action. Inside the underground shelter, trapped beneath a collapsed beam and scattered debris, was a young woman. Her name was Emily Hart. She had taken shelter during the tornado, but became pinned when the entrance caved in. She had been there for nearly 20 hours, dehydrated, weak, and unable to move. As they lifted her out and called for medical backup, Jack glanced at the bobcat again. It was sitting calmly at the tree line, watching everything unfold. Emily looked up through blurry eyes and asked, "Did someone find me?" Jack shook his head slowly. "No," he said, amazed even as the words came out of his mouth. "A bobcat did." The rescue crew stood in stunned silence, trying to understand what had just happened. It made no sense. No one had seen the cellar. No signs had pointed to it. The bobcat had led them straight to it, almost as if it knew. And then, as quietly as it had arrived, the animal turned and disappeared into the forest. They would call it luck. They would call it instinct. But for everyone who was there that morning, it felt like something more. Something miraculous had just begun, and no one had any idea just how deep the story would go. The emergency vehicle pulled away, its sirens fading into the distance as it carried Emily Hart to the hospital. Her condition was stable, but the shock lingered. She had survived one of the worst tornadoes in recent memory, and she owed her life to a wild animal no one could explain. Back at the edge of the woods, Jack Morgan stood quietly, staring into the forest where the bobcat had vanished. The rescue team had returned to their duties, searching for other survivors. But Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something larger was at play. Animals didn't behave like that. Not naturally. Not without reason. Later that afternoon, as the team paused for rest, Jack found himself speaking to a local wildlife officer named Sarah Quinn. She had arrived to assist with the displaced animals and had heard whispers about the miracle bobcat from the volunteers. "I've tracked bobcats for years," Sarah said, sipping from a canteen. "They're solitary, territorial, avoid humans unless cornered or desperate. This one didn't just avoid us," Jack replied. "It came straight to us, like it wanted us to follow." Sarah frowned, her mind working. Could be injury confusion, head trauma, but leading you to a buried cellar door? That's no accident. Jack nodded. Exactly. It didn't stumble into us. It found us. That night, with the emergency crews thinned out and the chaos calming, Jack returned alone to the woods. The storm had turned everything upside down. Twisted metal dangled from trees. Vehicles lay upside down like forgotten toys. But beyond the wreckage, nature was already trying to reclaim its ground. Jack returned to the spot near the uprooted oak. He stood quietly for several minutes, half hoping and half doubting. The bobcat would reappear. Then he heard it. Not a growl, not a hiss, a soft rustle in the brush. The bobcat stepped out from behind a clump of shattered trees. Its gait was still uneven, its body clearly wounded, but its eyes, they were alert, aware, watching. Jack knelt again. No sudden movements. Just calm. "You came back," he whispered, unsure why he was even speaking. The bobcat slowly approached, stopping just out of reach. It didn't bare its teeth. It didn't run. It sat. Jack didn't move. Every instinct told him not to. There was a quiet understanding in the air, the kind that doesn't need words. This creature, battered by the same storm that had torn through their town, seemed to be seeking something. That's when he saw it. The bobcat's side was bleeding again, a jagged gash across its flank that hadn't been visible in the earlier chaos. Jack reached slowly for his phone and called Sarah. "Bring a crate," he said quietly, "and a tranquilizer kit. The bobcat's back, and it's hurt." By the time Sarah arrived, dusk had begun to settle over the wreckage. A golden haze painted the sky, casting long shadows across the ruined forest. The bobcat didn't flee when she approached. In fact, it barely moved at all. They tranquilized it gently and transported it to a temporary wildlife center set up at the local fairgrounds, where injured animals were being treated. The veterinarian on call, Dr. Allen, examined the bobcat carefully. "Lucky it found you," Dr. Allen muttered, stitching the wound. "Would have died out there alone." Sarah stayed by its side the entire time. "This one's different," she murmured. "It doesn't act like a wild bobcat. It watches people, follows movement. It's like it understands more than it should." The team tagged it as BC-17, a standard identifier for wild rescues. But for everyone who had seen it in action, the label felt too sterile. They began calling it something else, Miracle. In the days that followed, Miracle remained in care. The team noticed unusual behavior. It didn't lash out. It didn't growl at strangers. It responded to voices, especially Jack's. When he visited, Miracle would lift its head, ears twitching, as if listening. Jack visited daily, bringing bits of cooked chicken or just sitting nearby. He didn't pet the animal. He didn't treat it like a house cat. But the connection was undeniable. Miracle would inch closer, resting beside the fence, blinking calmly at him. The town began to talk. First, it was whispers, then news articles. A bobcat rescuing a woman from a tornado? It was the kind of story people needed after days of trauma and loss. Reporters arrived. Photos were taken. Jack gave a few interviews, but downplayed the sensationalism. "I don't think the bobcat meant to be a hero," he told one reporter. "But it was one, whether it knew it or not." But even as the story gained attention, Jack couldn't ignore one lingering question. Why had the bobcat returned? And more importantly, Was there something else it was trying to show them? One evening, as he sat beside Miracle's enclosure, Jack noticed something strange. The bobcat was staring at his boots, then at the door. Then it stood, paced in a circle, and let out a low whine. It was restless, not just recovering, not just bored. It wanted to go back. Jack leaned forward, watching every movement. Miracle was pacing with purpose now, tail flicking in short, tense bursts. It looked directly at the woods beyond the camp. Jack felt a chill crawl up his spine. What are you trying to tell me, boy? Miracle stopped pacing. It sat, stared at him again, just like the first day. And in that moment, Jack knew the miracle wasn't over yet. Jack couldn't sleep that night. Miracle's behavior had unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite explain. This wasn't just restlessness from being caged. The bobcat was trying to communicate something. Its pacing, its intense stares, the way it paused and pointed its gaze toward the woods. It felt intentional, urgent. The next morning, Jack returned to the temporary shelter before sunrise. The sky was still dusky pink, dew clinging to the grass, the air cool and quiet. Miracle was awake, sitting by the edge of the enclosure, eyes locked on the trees in the distance. Jack crouched near the fence. You want to go back, don't you? The bobcat didn't blink. Jack stood and looked over at Sarah, who had just arrived with a coffee thermos in hand. What would it take, he asked, to track where this bobcat came from? Sarah raised an eyebrow. You want to follow it? Jack nodded. I think it's trying to tell us something. I don't know what, but I've seen enough to trust that it's not done. Sarah hesitated. It's still recovering, not fully mobile yet. Jack glanced back at the animal. Then we wait until it is. But when the time comes, I want to go with it. Over the next 3 days, Miracle's wounds healed quickly. Dr. Allen monitored its vitals and gave a cautious green light for release, but under supervision. Normally, injured wildlife were returned far from populated zones. But given Miracle's unusual behavior, Sarah agreed to a controlled return near the same wooded area where it had been found. A tracking collar was fitted, lightweight and non-invasive. Jack insisted on being there, riding in the back of the wildlife transport as they drove out toward the broken edge of the forest. The truck stopped where the road disappeared into collapsed trees. Beyond that was a path only Miracle seemed to know. They opened the gate. The bobcat stepped out slowly, not in fear, but with a quiet sense of purpose. It looked back at Jack once, then started walking, just like before. Sarah and Jack followed on foot, weaving through brush and broken branches. The woods were quiet. No bird song. No rustle of squirrels. Just the occasional creak of trees that had been scarred by the storm. Miracle moved with surprising speed now, weaving through the rubble, stopping occasionally to sniff the ground or circle a specific spot. Jack and Sarah followed every movement, their boots crunching through debris. Then the bobcat paused at a familiar tree line. It was the same area where Emily Hart had been found. But Miracle didn't stop there. It kept going, deeper this time, past the known trails, into a section that hadn't yet been searched. Thick undergrowth blocked their way, but the bobcat squeezed through with ease. Sarah pushed aside a fallen branch. This area wasn't even on the original search grid. They moved forward, and then Miracle stopped. It crouched low beside a patch of twisted sheet metal and bark, tail stiff, ears high. Jack stepped forward, heart thudding, and then he heard it, a faint, rhythmic sound. Whimpering, he dropped to his knees, brushed aside a layer of insulation, and froze. There, barely breathing, was a dog, a golden retriever, matted with mud and dried blood, lying beneath a collapsed section of roofing. One leg was pinned, and its eyes were glassy with exhaustion, but it was alive. "Oh, my God!" Sarah whispered. She dropped to her knees beside Jack. How did it survive out here? Jack reached out gently, whispering soothing words. The dog barely moved, too weak to respond. Miracle sat quietly nearby, watching, as if waiting for them to finish what had started. They radioed for a stretcher and carefully removed the dog from wreckage. Jack kept glancing at Miracle, trying to piece it together. The bobcat had returned to this exact spot. It had led them through the devastation. Again, to another living soul buried beneath destruction. This is more than instinct, Sarah said quietly. It has to be. As the golden retriever was lifted onto the stretcher, Jack noticed something tied loosely around its collar, a soaked mud-cake bandana with faded embroidery. It read, Maggie, if found, please call. The number was smudged and unreadable, but the name was enough. Jack's heart caught in his throat. Maggie, that was Emily Hart's dog. She had told them she was alone in the cellar. She'd assumed Maggie had run off or hadn't made it. But now, a week later, the dog had been found, barely clinging to life, guided to safety by a bobcat. Jack called the hospital immediately. An hour later, Emily stood near the recovery tent, eyes red with tears as she cradled Maggie's head in her lap. The dog whined softly and licked her hand, tail thumping weakly. Jack stood nearby, watching the reunion. You said, the bobcat led you to her too? Emily asked, voice trembling. He nodded. Same way it led us to you. Emily looked over at Miracle, who sat just outside the tent under gentle watch. Why? Why would it do that? Jack couldn't answer, but the weight of the moment said more than words ever could. Miracle didn't stay long after that. Once it had ensured both Emily and Maggie were safe, it turned again and disappeared into the trees. Gone, like a whisper in the wind. But something had changed in Jack. He had seen a wild animal act with more care, more purpose, than many humans would have in a crisis. It didn't make sense in any logical way, yet it had happened, and that meant there was still more to uncover, more than anyone knew. The town of Elridge had seen its share of storms before, but never anything like this. The tornado had taken lives, homes, and stability, but in the days that followed, it gave something back that no one expected. Hope. And strangely, that hope came in the form of a wild bobcat. Local news stations couldn't get enough of the story. Bobcat leads rescuers to trap woman, then her dog. Headlines spread. Interview requests flooded in. But Jack Morgan avoided the spotlight. He wasn't in this for attention. He was still trying to make sense of it. Why had the bobcat come back? Why lead them once, let alone twice? And more importantly, was that the end of it? Jack didn't think so. Miracle had returned to the wild after leading them to Maggie. But in Jack's gut, something still stirred, an itch that wouldn't settle, a sense of unfinished business. That night, he went back to the woods again, not with a team, not with cameras, just alone. He brought a small flashlight, a radio, and a satchel with fresh meat, just in case Miracle returned. The moon hung low, casting long, pale streaks through the damaged forest. The smell of damp wood and soil filled the air, heavy from the recent rains. Crows cawed in the distance. Twigs cracked under his boots. He reached the tree line near the old cellar. Everything was silent. Then a sound. A low growl? No, it was deeper, like a muffled bark. Jack froze, narrowing his ears toward the brush. Then he saw it, eyes glinting in the moonlight. Miracle. It stepped forward slowly, stopping just a few feet from him. Its fur looked healthier, its wounds almost fully healed. The bobcat stared at Jack, unmoving. Then it turned and started walking again. Jack didn't hesitate. He followed. They moved deeper than ever before. Branches whipped against his jacket. Mud sucked at his boots. The forest here felt different. Older, quieter. The destruction from the tornado was lighter here, but the silence was thicker, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. After nearly 20 minutes, Miracle stopped. They had arrived at what looked like the foundation of an old building. Crumbled stone walls. A collapsed roof covered in ivy and debris. Nature had almost fully reclaimed it. Jack carefully stepped closer. That's when he saw it. Beneath a beam, partially buried in ashen leaves, a small shoe. He dropped to his knees, heart hammering. It was a child's sneaker. Light blue, decorated with faded cartoon animals, covered in soot but intact. He looked up at Miracle. The bobcat hadn't moved. Jack turned back to the ruins and began clearing away the debris, heart racing. Within minutes, he uncovered a space beneath collapsed beams, a pocket, and in that pocket, a small body. But it moved. A child, barely 5 or 6, eyes shut, arms curled protectively around a stuffed animal, was breathing. Faintly, shallowly, but alive. "Dear God," Jack whispered. He radioed for help immediately. "This is Chief Morgan. I've got a live child. Repeat, live child, at the old Granger Cabin Foundation near Route 11. Need emergency response now." Miracle stepped back into the shadows, quietly watching. Within 20 minutes, EMTs had arrived and rushed the child away. Her name, they would later learn, was Lily Granger. She'd been missing since the tornado hit over a week ago. Her parents had assumed she'd been swept away when their home collapsed. But Lily had survived, trapped, injured, and silent, with only a cracked water bottle and stuffed toy for comfort. No one had known she was there, except, somehow, the Bobcat. How could it possibly know? Sarah asked later, after reviewing the site with Jack, how does a Bobcat find a human child? Or two humans and a dog? It doesn't make sense. Jack didn't answer right away. He was still staring into the trees, where Miracle had last stood before vanishing again. He finally said, "I don't think Miracle is just wandering. I think it's searching." Sarah tilted her head. "Searching for what?" Jack exhaled slowly. "I don't know, but we need to figure it out." The discovery of Lily Granger rocked the town. Once again, the Bobcat had done what humans hadn't. The media dubbed it the guardian of the tornado. Some claimed it was divine intervention. Others said the Bobcat had been trained, though no evidence supported that. Wildlife experts were baffled. And then a quiet detail surfaced, one that changed everything. Emily Hart, the first woman rescued, had once worked at a small animal rehab center 10 miles outside of Elridge. And years ago, they had briefly taken an orphan Bobcat cub, just a few weeks old. It had been found injured by the roadside and raised for 3 months until it was old enough to survive in the wild. Emily hadn't thought about it in years, but when shown a photo of Miracle, her face went pale. "I think that's him," she whispered. "I think he remembers me." Jack looked at her, stunned. "Are you saying the Bobcat knew who you were?" Emily nodded slowly. "It's the eyes. He used to stare at me like that when he was a baby, like he was studying me." The pieces started falling into place. Miracle hadn't just found them by accident. He had been looking for them, remembering, following the scent of those who had once shown him compassion, and guiding help to those who needed it most. But still, one question remained. What had driven Miracle to come back right after the tornado? What had started all of this? For days, Jack Morgan couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was buried within Miracle's actions. This wasn't just about random rescues. It wasn't coincidence. It wasn't instinct. It was as if the Bobcat had been following a trail, a mission that began long before the tornado ever touched down. After Emily Hart identified the Bobcat as the orphan she had once helped raise, Jack's curiosity turned into obsession. He started digging into the records of the old wildlife rehab facility where she'd worked. Most of the files had been moved or destroyed when the center shut down, but with Emily's help, they tracked down a retired volunteer who remembered the Bobcat cub vividly. He was different, the woman recalled. Quiet, observant. "We called him Ash because of the gray in his fur, like soot. He used to watch us from the corner, like he was trying to figure out who he could trust." Ash! Miracle had a name before the world ever knew him, a past, and then something else came to light. On the day the tornado struck Elridge, a call had been made to the county animal control hotline, just minutes before the cell towers went down. The voice was faint, panicked, but it came from a young girl in the rural outskirts. She reported a Bobcat circling the front porch and said it wouldn't leave. The dispatcher assumed it was a frightened animal displaced by the storm. But no one followed up. The storm arrived too fast. The address? Lily Granger's house. The same child who was found alive beneath the collapsed ruins nearly 10 days later. The same child the Bobcat had led them to. Jack sat in stunned silence when the report was read to him. He was trying to get someone to come. Before the storm hit, he whispered. He knew she was in danger. But how? Sarah asked. How could he possibly have known? That's not just instinct. That's awareness. Jack turned to Emily. Do you think it's possible he recognized her scent? Her voice? Something from years ago. Emily shook her head. She was just a toddler when I worked there. There's no way she could have interacted with him. And then the final piece fell into place. The stuffed animal Lily had been found clutching in the wreckage, a small Bobcat plush, nearly torn apart, was one of the toys Emily had kept in the rehab center. They used to place them in the dens of orphan cubs to reduce loneliness. Ash had grown up with that toy. When Jack brought it to Miracle's enclosure and showed it to him, the Bobcat didn't growl or run. Instead, he pressed his head against the cage bars and let out a deep, mournful purr, a sound no one had heard before. It wasn't just memory. It was recognition. He had come back because something familiar had drawn him, an object tied to a time when he was most vulnerable. The scent, the shape, the comfort of that toy, it had brought him to the edge of town, just as the storm rolled in, and when everything fell apart, he didn't run. He searched, tracked the scent, tracked them, the woman who had once saved him, the dog who had lived alongside her, the child whose toy had once shared his cage. They weren't strangers to him. They were family. In his own, wild way, he had remembered, and that memory had pulled him back through a broken world, through smoke, rubble, and danger, not for food, not for safety, but for something much more human, connection. Jack stood outside the enclosure the next morning, watching as Miracle paced slowly under the early morning sun. A light breeze rustled the tarp overhead. Sarah joined him in silence, both of them still reeling from the emotional wave of all. No one will believe this, she said finally. They don't have to, Jack replied. We were there. We saw what he did. We saw who he is. Sarah nodded. What happens now? Jack looked down at his boots, then back at Miracle. He came to us, Jack said, again and again, not for help, to give it. He led us to life when we only expected death. I think it's time we stop thinking of him as just an animal. Sarah turned to him. Then what do we call him? Jack smiled faintly. A miracle, just like we've been doing all along. The Bobcat sat, gazing at them calmly through the enclosure fencing. There was no fear in his eyes, no confusion, just understanding. He had done what he came to do. But what no one yet realized was that the story wasn't finished. 2 weeks after the tornado, the town of Elridge was slowly starting to breathe again. The constant hum of chainsaws and hammering had replaced the eerie silence that followed the storm. People worked side by side, often in silence, still processing the grief, but also holding on to something rare, a sense of shared purpose. Miracle had become the heart of that purpose. Everyone in town had heard the story by now. The wild Bobcat that had led rescuers to 3 lives buried beneath chaos. He wasn't just a local curiosity anymore. He was a symbol of instinct, of hope, of something that couldn't quite be explained. Jack Morgan found himself thinking about Miracle constantly. As fire chief, he had seen disasters before, and he'd always focused on rebuilding infrastructure. But this time, the rebuilding went deeper, into his own heart. He noticed how people treated each other differently now, how families hugged a little tighter, how strangers nodded in recognition, all because of one animal who chose not to run, but to lead. Emily Hart, having regained her strength, spent most of her days at the animal shelter. But every evening, she'd visit Miracle's temporary enclosure and sit quietly on a nearby bench. She didn't try to touch him or speak loudly. She just sat, sometimes reading a book, sometimes just watching the light filter through the trees. Maggie, her golden retriever, often accompanied her. What surprised even Emily was the quiet bond that had formed between the 2 animals. Maggie would lie down near the enclosure, and Miracle would approach the fence, sitting across from her, close but calm. There was no barking, no tension, just understanding. It was as if they shared a memory they couldn't describe. Lily Granger, still with a slight limp from her injuries, had returned to her routine slowly. But every time she passed by Miracle's enclosure, she'd stop to visit. She always brought Ash, her now repaired stuffed Bobcat, and proudly held it up. He's better now, she'd say, smiling. Just like you. Miracle would come forward when she spoke, ears tilting toward her voice. He never acted like a pet. He didn't beg for food or pace for attention, but he responded to voices, to presence, to the quiet kindness of a child who didn't fear him. The town held a community meeting to decide Miracle's fate. Wildlife officials debated what would happen next. Some argued for full release into the wild, while others warned that Miracle might not survive alone. His bond with humans could make him vulnerable. It was Jack who proposed a solution. "We don't owe him a cage," he said during the meeting. "We owe him a place that honors who he is, wild, yes, but also deeply connected to us." And so, the town voted unanimously to build a sanctuary. It wouldn't be a zoo. It wouldn't be a prison. It would be a space, open, safe, and respected. The land chosen was near the old forest, far from roads, but close enough for the community to visit. Volunteers came in droves. Farmers, carpenters, students, retirees. All wanted help. They built walking paths and viewing decks, natural dens and shaded shelters. Children painted signs and posted drawings. "Welcome home, Miracle. Our guardian, brave heart of the woods." When it was finished, the town held a quiet ceremony. No microphones, no media frenzy, just those who had been there. Jack, Emily, Sarah, Lily, and a handful of others gathered by the gate. The enclosure door was opened. Miracle stepped out slowly at first, then confidently, scanning the horizon. His fur shimmered in the sun, lean muscles moving beneath his coat. He walked a few paces, then stopped at a low hill. Turning back once, he stared at the group. They held their breath. He blinked, slow and soft, and then he vanished over the rise, into the brush, his tail flicking once before disappearing into the tall grass. No one spoke for a long moment. He was free, but more than that, he was home. That evening, Jack sat alone on his porch. The night was quiet, the stars crisp and clear. He could still hear the faint sound of wind rustling through the trees. But unlike the storm's roar, this wind was soft, almost like a voice. He thought of everything that had happened. The lives lost, the lives saved, the unexpected turns, the quiet acts of courage, the impossible instincts of a wild creature who had chosen connection over fear. Jack wrapped his fingers around his mug, took a sip of cooling coffee, and whispered, "Thank you, Ash." Far off, in the dark beyond the tree line, something moved. A shape, a rustle, a quiet signal that the story wasn't over. That maybe, just maybe, the miracle still watched, and that it would return again, only when it was needed,